Well, today we're talking about 5 things that we've learned in our first year raising Silkies, which we think are all positive. Overall, they're pretty enjoyable chickens and not a lot of work, which is kind of nice. It's basically almost the end of December, which means we're kind of pretty much to the end of the year. So what better time to do a little bit of a reflection looking back on our first year raising Silkies and talk about some of the things that I guess I'm going to say we learned that I think are really big positives to having Silkies and just raising them in general. So we're going to get right into it. Thing number 1 that we've learned is Silkies are really easy to manage, and I mean exceptionally easy to manage. Part of that comes from being small. They're not a very big chicken, so they're just not taxing on your system, even if you only have a small area to raise them in. They're also relatively friendly, which that will come back as another item, but I think that does factor into it because they have such a long history being raised in very, very close quarters with humans. Been raised that way for so long that it really has made them a bird that all around is just super easy to work with. 2 things though that I think really factor into that sort of ease of management really are because of the Silkies' unique qualities, i.e. their feathers. 1, they can't really fly, which at face value is a real obvious one, but that means they are quite content to stay where you put them. The other part still I think has to do with the feathers, and it's the crest. The crest sometimes gets a bit of a bad rap, but it also, I'm going to say this, seems to calm them down a little bit. They're a little less reactive to what's going on around them. If you have to work with them during the day, they're very easy to work with. They're catchable without the rigmarole that you tend to find with some of the bigger chickens, i.e. we used to do all of our chicken handling at night when we had the partridge chanticleers because it was really the only time we could catch them. Whereas these little guys, if we needed to, even right now, we could probably go and catch some of them, even out here in the pasture, if we absolutely had to. So as you see, it's not exactly a hard thing to do. And it also makes them really nice. I'm going to say it for kids. You do hear this fairly often, but this is a breed that's quite enjoyable for kids to work with. And they're not really very flighty, and as you can see, a little bit of handling goes a long way. I mean, these chickens are not exactly put out by the getting picked up. And I can feel, which kind of goes into another one of my topics, I can feel she's already filling up in the crop quite a bit, which is not a bad thing. So item number 2, and this one actually was a little bit of a surprise, but Silkies are really clean. Now, anybody who's kept any kind of bird of any kind, like any kind, knows birds are pretty messy, whether it's food related or what comes out the other end. But compared to larger chickens, I'm absolutely amazed, and some of it I know has to do with their size, but at how clean they are. They really don't make a lot of mess, and I'm going to show you that. So here's the coop. Nothing fancy, but you can see, I mean, obviously I'm a little bit fabricating when I say you can't tell there's been chickens in here, but for the most part this has stayed very dry and very clean. So this is something we do daily in this particular coop to try to find eggs, because this group has a tendency to bury them. But you can see this really is going to make exceptional deep bedding, and when you have a climate that's a little cooler, that's I think where this is important, because if they're staying cleaner, that means you don't have to change this bedding out as regularly, which means it actually saves you a little bit. Well, these birds are quite happy. This is another thing about the management part for me. They're just so calm. They just kind of go about their business. It doesn't really matter if you're in doing your daily routine with them. They don't seem put off by it at all. And these birds are enjoying a little bit of the cooked, yeah, basically lamb stew with some vegetables that we cooked up for them from some of the less edible portions of the lamb. So it's good use of everything that we grow here on the homestead. Item number 3, foraging. Now, this is something I think if you do some research online, you're probably going to go down the line of being told or find information that says they're not great foragers. I would argue, but with a little bit of a disclaimer to that. Something we found is compared to the Chanticleers, or larger sized chickens, they don't range as far. I.e., when you let them out for the day, they still range, don't get me wrong, but they don't travel as far as some of those larger birds do. Like we had birds that would wander way down into our food forest area or towards the neighbors, all that sort of thing. The Silkies definitely stay closer to home, but they still do all the same things as normal chickens. But the one part on foraging that we find they're a little interesting is they really like greens. Now, all chickens like greens, but we've at least found over this past summer that these little Silkie chickens are really big herbivores. They still want the insects, they still want the bugs, they still want all that stuff, but they are completely content to demolish weeds and grass and all of that other stuff. Like I don't know how to better explain it than it's been interesting for their size, how much of the green matter they choose to consume, which has even led us down the road, and we've done some experiments, but stay tuned for future videos on this, of using them in the garden, which is not somewhere you would typically think to let your chickens out, because we all know most of the bigger breeds will just decimate your garden. We have noticed, because they don't dig as much, and because they have this preference for especially a lot of the softer green vegetation and insects, of course, that in small numbers they might actually be compatible with some garden vegetables, which is a pretty big asset on a small scale. Item number 4, and I think this one is going to come as no surprise. Anybody who's read anything about Silkies knows that the literature tells you they are exceptional broody birds. And although we have limited experience with that, because we only had one group of adult birds this year, that is definitely the case. What I find interesting about it, though, is, and this is, I think, saying something because I've worked with broody birds for my entire homesteading career, whether it's standard sized chickens, geese, pigeons, ducks, turkeys. I've kind of done it all, and each one has their own little unique things about them that can make it a challenge, but it can also be very worthwhile using broody hens. The one thing I'll say about the Silkies is they're dirt simple, to the point which you can actually even like get in there and intervene a bit, and they're not as temperamental as some of the other species as far as getting bothered by you. And I think that kind of goes back to a lot of these things all kind of meld together into just potentially their history with humans. They're really not put off by being in a very humanized setup, I'll put it that way. So thing number 5 that we wanted to talk about was kind of their social order. Something we've noticed is, going back to number 1, talking about them being easy to manage and relatively docile, they're typically that way with each other as well. Now, I'm not saying they don't have a pecking order, not saying that, they aren't typical chickens sometimes, but we've definitely found amalgamating individuals and switching groups up and that sort of thing goes a lot smoother. We don't seem to find the fighting that we typically get with the bigger birds or have had with the bigger birds. That kind of goes right back around full circle to being easier to manage, because don't get me wrong, roosters are still roosters, but it's the hen side of it that the hens just don't seem to be as aggressive with each other, and that's made it a lot easier to re-amalgamate broody hens and their chicks, and basically everybody seems to get along, which just makes it far easier to work with them, and then makes it more enjoyable to work with them. And that's one big thing for us, at least, is the enjoyment factor. And I'm not going to say we didn't enjoy the Chanticleers, but with some changes and some other stressors that affect things here, this is much more enjoyable for us right now. And something that, even though chickens in general are relatively easy, they're the gateway animals, this is even easier. And it still produces usable products in the form of eggs and meat, and everything about it is just easier, or feels easier to us. And so these 5 things that I've sort of brought up, I really factor heavy into the decision to keep going with this, and we'll see where it takes us, and kind kind of go from there. But hopefully at least this gives you a little bit of food for thought, or thought for food, or thought for chickens. And yeah, if you don't have chickens and you're thinking and you only have a small space, etc., think about silkies. Like, actually give them some thought, because I think all too often they're passed over because of the fact that they're just sort of given that nomenclature of being a cute, fluffy, cuddly pet chicken and having no real usable value. But I will again say, I don't think that's the case, and it just takes looking at it from a little different angle.